has come to our family.
I'm Reginald Gigington, and you can call me Reggie. And today I'll be continuing my painting journey through the miniatures of the Darkest Dungeon board game by Mythic Games. In today's video, we'll be moving on to the second half of the starter party, the Red Hook. I'll be teaching you how to paint Paracelsus and Junia, the blighting poisoner and the not-so-chaste woman of the light. As I mentioned in the last video, there are no tutorials out there for this sort of thing, so we'll be learning together what does and doesn't work. Now, starting off with Paracelsus the Plague Doctor, I've already primed the entire miniature in black, which is my preferred color for priming. To begin painting, we'll actually be mixing paints for our first step, as the Plague Doctor's apron has a certain brownish hue to it. Note that as each color gets used, its icon will appear in the corner, and a list of each color used will appear after the mini is complete. As always, be sure to use a little water and apply several thin coats for the best coverage. Don't worry if you happen to spill over onto some of the details, we're just base coating at this point, we can fix up smaller nooks and crannies later. Our first colors will be a 2-to-1 mix of Mechanicus Standard Gray to Steel Legion Drab. This should help give the gray a little bit of earthy warmness to it that, if we're lucky, will shine through even after we've applied the dark wash to the apron later. You'll see this again on the beak and later when we highlight the hood, that the Plague Doctor has a little bit of beige brown that subtly filters through their colors. Up next, we'll be painting Rhinox hide all over the leather parts, which are the apron and the shoulder pads, plus the belt. The next step will be Vallejo green-gray on the green parts of the dress. That's the edges right here. Additionally, while this isn't modeled on the physical miniature, the trim of the dress needs a free-handed green band around it. I saved this step for the very end, around the time that I do the freehand shadows, but in truth you can do it at any time you like, following the same steps that we use for the rest of the green parts. Additionally, be sure to get the inside of the hood. There's a small strip of green between the hood and the mask on her left cheek. Now, we'll be using Wraithbone on the beak and arm bandages. Wraithbone can be very chalky, so I'd really recommend using a comparable alternative from Vallejo or Army Painter, or whatever your preferred brand is for this step. It just so happens that this is what's available to me. For chunky paints like this, just be sure to thin them out with some water and shake them up as much as you can before using them. For the metal spikes on the shoulders, as well as the mask's lenses and belt buckle, we'll be using Stormhost Silver, being careful not to spill over onto the colors around it. For the vial and bottle, we'll be painting these all over in Ulthuan Gray, which is a nice blue-tinted off-white that will help give the illusion of glass. Up next, we'll be applying our washes, Nuln Oil, all over the beak, arms, and gray parts of the dress. The only parts that don't get any Nuln Oil at this point are the bottles and the green trim. For the bottles, we'll handle those later, but for the trim, we'll use a thinned-down Agrax Earthshade. Not much, just enough to keep it from overpowering the grain. For the lenses, we're going to very precisely apply some Black Templar. you spill over onto the beak, you're going to have a bad time, since you'll be trying to cover up black with white. So try not to do that. I tell you that with painful experience on my side. For the beak, we'll be using Rakarth flesh around the seam, avoiding the top ridge and only going up about a third of the way. Up next, we're going to make a 1-to-1 mix of Rakarth flesh and Ulthuan Grey, and edge highlight the seam of the mask. We'll also be applying some Wraithbone to the top ridge of the mask. This should round out the edge highlighting for it, and give it a nice bone white appearance. We'll also be applying this mix on the arm bandages, on the edges opposite of where the black wash has settled. For the green parts, we're going to be doing some more mixing, this time using a 1-to-1 mix of scorpion green and gray green, applied over most of the green with a few exceptions. Use the image for reference here, but the tip of the side parts here don't get a highlight and stay dark, just like the in-game model. Then, we're going to do a similar process, but with a 2-to-1 mix of scorpion green to gray green, highlighting an even smaller portion, just the center of each light green section. For the trim at the bottom of the dress, use the natural folds in the fabric as guidelines for where the highlights should be placed. The recesses will have no highlights, whereas the parts furthest outwards will have the 2-to-1 bright highlight. Rounding out the last of our mixes, we'll be preparing a 1-to-1 mix of Dawnstone and Steel Legion Drab for highlights on her hood and dress. At this point, we're going to use Steel Legion Drab over top of the Rhinox hide parts, highlighting just the top-facing edges of the shoulder pads and the raised ridges of the leather apron. This just leaves the vials, which we'll be covering in Coelia green shade to give them a blue tint and a glassy appearance. However, to really sell the effect, we need to return the original off-white color to some select parts. For the vial, hit the rim with Ulthuan Grey, and for the ball, do a band around the neck of the bottle, the rim of the bottle, and the body of the sphere, leaving the green shade around the seam between the neck and rim and neck and ball. Now for the liquid inside, use Vallejo dark green on the bottom of the ball, not quite touching the hand on either side, and going up to about halfway through. It's critical at this step, since we're painting a fluid to follow gravity. This liquid should be parallel with the horizon, so be sure to be very careful doing this step. To give the appearance of the liquid, we'll be painting a thin line of scorpion green between the off-white and the dark green, just following the horizon line we made in the last step. Lastly, we'll be applying pure white to give a reflective glare on the top half of the ball and the vial's rim. Our last step is the Abaddon Black Shadows. I experiment briefly with Black Templar here, but I think Abaddon Black gives it better coverage and has less transparency, which improves the final result. It's during this step that I do the trim on the dress, which over top of the trim you'll have to add tiny black rectangles. These don't need to be super precise or even, so long as the lines are thin enough and vaguely rectangular shaped. I also paint the underside of the dress and half of the leather apron in black. A few freehand lines, semicircles, and X's on cloth gives it a really good cartoonish vibe, which you can see on the hood. And that just leaves the base, for which we'll be using the standard scheme of Mechanicus Standard Grey with Nuln Oil over top. In my last video, I dry brushed Dawnstone over it, but in truth, I'm not convinced it adds much to the effect. With Black Templar applied to the rim, Paracelsus is done. Up next is Junia the Vestal, again following the card art. To start, we'll be applying Leadbelcher to the steel portions of her armor, much like we did in the previous episode with Reynald, the Crusader. With the two sharing some level of connection, both being armored warriors of the Church, I think it makes sense to use the same colors and techniques for their armor, to demonstrate that they were feasibly produced by the same blacksmiths and artisans. While painting the steel, don't forget the mace strapped to her back, as it too is that same gunmetal material. We're going to leave a few spots blank here, like we did with the trim on Paracelsus' dress, since they'll be easier to do later, right around the sleeves. Next, we'll be applying Steel Legion Drab all over the ground cloth. That's the hood, the robes, the gloves, and the sleeves, particularly the ones bunched up around the armpits. The rest of the sleeves are going to be done in Leadbelcher, but it's easier to see after the Steel Legion Drab is applied. You'll be able to see in subsequent steps as I apply the rest of the Leadbelcher, piece by piece. Now we'll be applying Averland's Sunset to the trim around her dress, which this time I'm happy to note is modeled onto the figure. When painting embossed trim, it's best to try and use the side of the brush rather than the tip, and let your brush run parallel to the surface you're painting. This lets you avoid accidentally spilling over onto the recessed surface around it. Averland's Sunset is quite thin, so remember to use 2 coats here if necessary. Next, we're going to use Corn Red on 2 spots, here on the cover of the book, and here on the hilt of the mace. Be careful not to spill over onto the gloves when doing the book, or the armor for the mace. I recommend using a fine-tipped brush for this part. Now we'll be doing the skin, for which we'll use Cadian Flesh Tone just on the face. Up next, we'll be applying Rakarth Flesh on the pages of the book, as well as the bandana under her hood, again avoiding spillover. Additionally, on the back, we'll be doing the straps holding her mace, using that parallel brush technique I mentioned earlier. And now come the washes, with Nuln Oil all over the entire miniature, with the exception of the yellow parts of her trim, the cover of her book, and her face. For the yellow trim and the red cover of her book, we'll be using a light coat of Agrax Earthshade, just like we did on Paracelsus, whereas we'll be saving the face for later. To give it some pop, we'll be applying Retributor armor on the corners of her book, as well as this little detail on the center of her chest armor. You really want to be careful doing this part, not to get gold onto the steel parts, since it'll be hard to cover that up without having to redo the entire steel section. To highlight the yellow parts of the cloth, we'll be applying an edge highlight of Averland's Sunset on the trim, while hitting the raised edges of her belt as well. This will leave its recesses stained black while maintaining a bright color throughout. Now we'll be washing the skin and the gold parts on her book and chest piece using Flesh Wash. And with the face given a bit more depth, we'll be using Cadian Flesh Tone once again to bring back the highlights. For this, it'll be the nose, the cheeks, and the chin. You want to avoid the eyes and underneath of the nose, as they're the most shadowed locations by the brow and hood respectively. Our last step will be Abaddon Black Shadows. For the face, you'll want to use an extremely precise brush to do her upper lip, a dot on her lower lip, and her laugh lines in black. To accomplish this, I recommend actually going back after you've applied the black and using Cadian Flesh Tone once again, running along the black lines to make them even thinner than you could otherwise get them to be. They really need to be razor sharp for this part. And that leaves the base, which you should know how to do by now. Mechanica Standard Gray, Nuln Oil, and Black Templar for the rim. Rounding out the Vestal, we've completed the core adventuring party of Darkest Dungeon, the Red Hook. Just like last time, I reiterate that you're in no rush while painting, and to take your time. And if you ever mess up, don't sweat it, just go back and paint over your mistakes. Have fun painting your Darkest Dungeon miniatures, and feel free to tag me on Instagram, @ReggieGick, to show me how yours turned out. Links to my affiliated socials can be found in the description. Feel free to subscribe or like the video if you enjoyed it, and I will see you soon with another painting tutorial.